I began my first month of life, Southern Africa was a major focus point of the world's attention. The fighting over the past 10 months had seen some of the largest conventional battles ever fought on the African continent. The town of Carnival, with its vital bridge and airfield, was seen as the center for a gargantuan clash between Cuban, Angolan, and South African forces. The South African government and military had never ordered their forces to capture Carnival, and the SADF had succeeded in their aim of driving the bulk of Fapla forces back east beyond the Cuta River. However, the reversals they had suffered in their efforts to drive the last Fapla brigades from the Tampa Triangle had reduced the battle to a stalemate. The town was still under artillery fire, but there was no longer any possibility of driving Fapla back further east. Not content with a stalemate at Carnival, Fidel Castro was determined to present the Cuban people with a great victory to justify the great effort expended in Angola. Towards this end, the Cuban 50th Division, together with their Fapla and SWAPO allies, were continuing to move closer to the southwestern border of Southwest Africa, Namibia. Yet even as I opened my eyes to the world for the first time, the Buffaloes of 3-2 Battalion were once again in the thick of the new fighting. On May the 12th, Commandant Jan Hoogaard was tasked with neutralizing the threat posed by a joint SWAPO Cuban task force set up in the highly fortified town of Techipa. This sizable enemy formation consisted of a number of tank companies protected by surface-to-air missiles, in addition to a sizable force of infantry and artillery. Situated north of the Kunene-Rukana hydroelectric plant, this body of enemy troops was rightly seen as the biggest threat to South African interests in the area. As the Cubans continued to move steadily southwards in early June, something drastic would have to be done. On the 8th of June, after returning from the border, the SADF Senior General, Jannie Geldenhuys, briefed the press on the deteriorating situation at the border and announced the call-up of 140,000 men from the conventional forces of South Africa's citizen force, by far the largest call-up in the history of the border war.
We're safe, we've got a great defence force, and if they're going to call up everyone, I'll be proud to go.
Our security must come first, second and last.
I think we should go in and clean up.
It was hoped that the announcement of such an enormous call-up of men would be enough to dissuade the Cubans from any further aggressive actions. During all the fighting around Mavinga and Carnival, the total number of SADF fighting troops never exceeded 3,000. It would therefore be very foolish for the Cubans to take on the full conventional might of South Africa's armed forces. There were, however, other things driving the Cuban aggression beyond purely military considerations. Having begun the process of negotiations, Fidel Castro realized that sooner or later he would have to withdraw Cuban troops from Angola, as neither the United States nor the Soviet Union had any appetite for further involvement in the country. The Cold War was ending before his eyes. The question now for Fidel Castro was how to withdraw the troops from Angola in such a way that it would allow him to claim victory for the people back in Cuba. In spite of the call-up of 140,000 men, for the moment in June, the Cubans held the military advantage. They probed the airspace of Southwest African Namibia with their high-flying MiG-23s. With air superiority secured, the Cubans initiated an aggressive plan to bomb South African bases and possibly even invade Southwest Africa Namibia if the South Africans struck first, or if there were no concessions made at the peace talk. After forming up a divisional headquarters in May, the South Africans would have to wait for the bulk of the citizen force units to arrive. These units were only set to arrive in the theatre in early August, and would then still need further training until being ready to be operationally deployed at the end of August. That meant that for a period of roughly 2 months, the only units available to the South Africans were the Raiders of 3-2 Battalion, the local counter-insurgency units, and 61 Mech, who had by now refreshed themselves back in their base at Umataya. 61 Mech was duly sent north to protect the Rukana-Kalek hydroelectric installations. Whilst the young conscripts made the most of their surroundings, their officers were busy planning the best way of stopping the Cubans from marching south from Techipa. 3-2 Battalion's reconnaissance teams had seen that the Cubans and SWAPO had transformed Techipa into a mini version of the Tampa Triangle, with minefields and heavy fortifications. Not wanting to walk into another trap, the SADF decided instead to draw the Cubans out of Techipa and into the open, where they could be shelled by the South African artillery. Accordingly, on the 18th of June, one battery of G5s and a battery of G2s was moved into position south of Techipa. It was against this backdrop of impending war that the diplomats met once more in Cairo on June the 24th.
At last, the South Africans, Angolans, Cubans and Americans sat to discuss concrete steps to end the war. But the fighting at Cuito-Cuanaval continued, and every minor victory or loss altered the givens at the negotiating table. The next meeting, held in Cairo, would make or break the peace process.
When ministers get around a big table in a major capital like Cairo, they really can't help themselves. They just can't resist microphones. And they just go from bad to worse. And Risquet managed to say things about Cuba's heroic contributions to African stability and development, and Cuba's intention to see to it that peace would come when there was an end of apartheid and when there was an end of this and an end of colonial rule in Namibia.
It was a meeting almost of emotional hatred. Mr. Risquet, he started by launching a vicious attack on us. Vicious. Saying, you've always been imperialists, racists, capitalists, causing trouble wherever you went, etc., etc.
At that point, Puk Botha and Magnus Milan just went after the Cubans, and it was very dramatic. And it was basically a test of manhood. A lot of testosterone in the atmosphere, I think, is the way to put it.
Entretanto, Puk Botha, se eu fosse jovem, jogávamos aqui a soco, íamos jogar pancada, porque eu não admito uma coisa desse. Então, aí tá bom, intervalo. Calmar a coisa.
Vengo a buscar un tabaco, si no de la prensa. Only for a cigar. I'm not making any statement, I'm just looking for a cigar.
It seemed the talks were headed for total breakdown. But later that night, an unexpected turn of events opened a new window of opportunity.
We went for a drink in this pub in the Cairo Hotel. There were some Cubans, including Mr. Risquet. Then we had a drink together, and I said to him, has it ever occurred to you that we could both be winners? And he chuckled in his drink, and he said, what do you mean? I said to him, look, to put it in simple terms, if we carry on with this war, we will both be losers. If you withdraw your troops on the basis of having given Namibia its independence, your leader, Fidel Castro, can claim that he won. You claim a victory of a greater nature, namely the freedom of the people of Namibia you have achieved. And I say to the white voters of South Africa, I got rid of the Cuban troops in Angola. And our war is also ended. That makes us both winners. And suddenly I could see a total dramatic change in his whole attitude.
Like a salesman who inflates his prices only to be negotiated down to his original position, Botha had finally gotten the Cubans to agree to withdraw on South Africa's original terms. The question now was whether this verbal agreement would hold long enough to be set down on paper. With the military men unaware of how the talks in Cairo were going, they continued their planning on how to deal with the Cuban threat at Techipa. Commandant Jan Hooghart, commanding the 3-2 Battalion Raiders harassing the Techipa garrison, knew firsthand how dangerous the town had become. Only days before, he had narrowly escaped being shot down by powerful Cuban surface-to-air missiles whilst flying in a Bosbok light reconnaissance aircraft. By the time the 3-2 Battalion's commanding officer, Miguel Delport, took over command of the SADF forces at Calais, the attack plans against the Chipa was almost complete. Rather than risk another Tampo-style battle by attacking the town directly, the SADF would once again rely on their artillery to soften up the enemy's defences. 61 mech would then lie in ambush south of the town to deal with any Cuban Fapla columns that may come south looking for revenge. In order to increase his flexibility, the SADF commander had ordered the engineers to build ramps up to the Calais wall so he could drive his heavy vehicles across there, rather than the smaller bridge at Rukana where the enemy expected him. So in spite of the ongoing peace talks, D-Day for the South African attack was planned for the 26th of June. Sitting on a kopje outside of Techipa, Commandant Hooghart was determined to get revenge on the Cuban SAM batteries that had almost shot him down. Small teams of 3-2 Battalion men released a number of weather balloons filled with metallic chaff. At 8 p.m, the Cuban missile batteries reacted to the balloons, unleashing a powerful barrage of SAM-6 missiles into the air. Their launch positions were carefully plotted by the watching SADF artillery observers who sent the coordinates to the awaiting G5 gunners. South African artillery opened up, neutralizing Cuban missile batteries, artillery positions, command bunkers and equipment. For over 2 hours, the town of Techipa and the forces stationed there were plastered with heavy artillery shells. The guns disengaged and packed up around 10 p.m. that evening. During that time, Major Hannes Nortman and the Ratels of 3-2 Battalion's anti-tank squadron had finally caught up with 61 mech, laying in ambush south of the town. Until only a few days previously, the SADF's premier panzer fighter had been overlooking Kutakarnaval, preventing another breakout. Now deployed to the southwest, Nortman, who had played such an important role during the first clash of the campaign, was determined to play an equally important part in what would turn out to be the final conventional battle fought by the SADF. As dawn broke on the morning of the 27th of June, Nortman was in command of a large group of Ratels probing north after receiving reports of advancing Cuban armour. As the Ratels moved forward tentatively, Nortman scanned the bush ahead from the commander's seat of his Ratel. Suddenly, an RPG-7 was fired from 20 meters away, knocking out a Ratel. With the battle underway, Cuban tanks suddenly appeared in the front and to the flank of the Ratels. Outgunned though he was, Nortman kept firing, knocking out another tank. As Cuban and Angolan infantry swarmed around the Ratels, Nortman was wounded in the hand and the neck whilst manning his 30 cal machine gun. When the Olifants moved up and destroyed another tank and some armoured vehicles, there was finally enough of a lull for the Ratels to recover and reposition. The Ratel had been knocked out by one of the tanks, killing its commander, Lieutenant Mayron. The SADF's problems were not over yet, as they discovered that a further Cuban column was heading south to outflank them and cut off their escape route back to Rukana and Calais. Pulling back to avoid being cut off, the SADF once more allowed the artillery to take over, as the guns pounded the advancing columns. With the withdrawal complete and the columns halted around 1 p.m, Major Nortman returned to Calais to have his wounds treated. No sooner had the Rukholz ambulance in which he was being treated moved closer to base than a flight of 4 MiG-23s suddenly appeared over the Calais Dam, dropping parachute-retarded bombs on the dam wall and hydroelectric installations. Minutes later, another flight of MiGs arrived flying low. Further bombs impacted on the dam wall and ramps leading up to it. The last MiG dropped 2 bombs. One destroyed the water pipeline to Avombo. The other bomb landed next to a group of parked SADF vehicles. In the explosion, 10 men from 8 side were killed when their biffle was hit by the blast. One of the MiGs was brought down by 20mm anti-aircraft fire, crashing in southern Angola. By 2:30, it was all over. The fighting on the 27th of June came as a shock for both sides, especially since they had agreed to the framework of a peace treaty only days before. For the South African public, long accustomed to cheap and easy victories in Angola, when they were told anything at all, the killing of 12 servicemen in one day was especially troubling. If one bomb could instantly kill 10 national servicemen, how many of their sons and fathers would have to die before the Cuban threat was overcome? The South African government was fully aware that the white electorate would not long support military action that resulted in heavy casualties, not on a battleground so far away. Furthermore, Pik Botha and the diplomats had finally gotten the Cubans to agree to their original principles. The last thing they now wanted was for the military to throw that away with some fresh offensive. And so, in spite of the outcry, the Battle of Calais, fought between the SADF, Cuban army, and SWAPO elements, was in fact the final battle that South African troops ever fought in Angola. The Cubans kept on probing with their MiGs and making blustering noises about their big victory. But the fact remained that the SADF remained in possession of the Calais hydroelectric plant and the surrounding area until the very end of the conflict. South African intelligence had estimated about 300 Cubans were killed, mainly by artillery, during the course of the battle. Whether or not these numbers were accurate will never be known. What the battle did achieve was that it allowed Fidel Castro to claim that he had won a great victory to the Cuban people back at home. The South African government was happy for him to make these claims, as they knew that the course towards a settlement was now unstoppable. Having saved face with the big battle, Cuba would now do what for years they had refused to do, namely withdraw all Cuban troops from Angola in exchange for a South African withdrawal from Angola and Namibia. This agreement was the basis for the peace agreement that would now be set down in writing when the ministers met for the next round of peace talks. The next round of talks commenced almost 2 weeks later, in New York, starting on July the 11th. The belligerents finally put down on paper the principles of a ceasefire and peace deal. The New York principles that emerged from these talks firmly established the policy of linkage. Further talks in Geneva, held in early August, set out detailed conditions for the settlement. The principles set out were as follows. South Africa would withdraw all its troops from Angola by September the 1st and begin implementing UN Resolution 435, which would lead to the independence of Namibia. In exchange, Cuba would withdraw all its troops according to an agreed-upon timetable. And so not only was this the final end to the Battle of Cuito Carnaval, it also marked the end to South African military involvement in Angola. The remaining G5s packed up in August, and the deadly shelling of Cuito Carnaval came to an end. As the troops finally returned from Angola, they left happy, glad to be going home, yet proud that they had done the job asked of them. With Cuban and Angolan observers in attendance, the engineers dismantled the bridges and brought to a close a conflict that had begun in 1975, when my father and his comrades had been sent north of the border in Operation Savannah. The Cubans too withdrew their troops from Angola. The Cold War and the time of the Internationalista, revolutionary fighter, was over. Yet whilst the foreign powers withdrew their troops under the watchful eyes of the superpowers, the tripartite agreement, signed at the UN headquarters on the 22nd of December 1988 by the foreign ministers of South Africa, Cuba and Angola, did not in fact bring an end to the Angolan Civil War. With the tripartite agreement signed in December 1988, the incoming year, 1989, would be the last year of South Africa's border war. Starting in 1966 with the first SWAPO attacks, the border war and service at the border had become a major part of the South African psyche. Since 1974, conscripts, citizen force members, professional soldiers, sailors, airmen and police had patrolled the sparsely populated bush of Southwest Africa looking for an elusive enemy. And now, in 1989, that all came to an end. As South Africa began implementing UN Resolution 435, they dismantled most of their bases and sent their heavy troops and equipment back to South Africa. No longer would Recce's and 3-2 Battalion men admire the pristine wildlife of northern Namibia. Fort Doppies and the magnificent Buffalo Base were both closed down. Even local units like Kufut and 101 Battalion handed in their heavy weapons and awaited demobilization. Then, on April 1st, 1989, the day that the United Nations Transition Assistance Group was officially supposed to start administering the country, SWAPO launched a massive invasion. From their bases in southern Angola, the SWAPO infiltrators moved into northern Namibia. The 9-day war had started. In a brutal series of firefights, the counterinsurgency units of Kufut and 101 Battalion were rearmed and, together with limited SADF reinforcements, battled the heavily armed SWAPO infiltrators. By the time that SWAPO leader Sam Nujuma finally called off the offensive and ordered his fighters to return to their bases on April the 9th, at least 263 guerrillas and 27 security force personnel were dead. This intense period of fighting was the final spasm of the Bush War. A ceasefire was soon re-established, and the UN gradually took over the management of the country as the elections drew nearer. Voting finally took place between the 7th and 11th of November. The South Africans were hoping that SWAPO would not win a majority, but for any serviceman who had spent his time in Ovomboland, he knew that the Ovombos, Namibia's largest tribe, had long ago given their loyalty to SWAPO. Unsurprisingly, therefore, SWAPO won 57% of the vote, and Sam Nujuma became the first democratically elected president, and on the 21st of March 1990, Namibia officially became an independent republic. Angolan fighters who had fought for the FNLA before being recruited to fight for the SADF form an integral part of this story. The deeds of 3-2 Battalion in the 13 years of war are the stuff of legend. This unit was rightfully regarded as one of the most elite fighting forces on the African continent. Throughout the fighting around Mavinga, Kuta Carnival and Kalek, the Buffaloes of 3-2 Battalion were always to be found where the action was fiercest. The military establishment had great regard for the Buffaloes and was determined that they would not be left behind when the peace came. As such, all the Angolan soldiers were given South African citizenship, and 3-2 Battalion's base was relocated in South Africa. But if the men at the sharp end of the SADF held the Buffaloes in high regard, the same could not be said about the bureaucrats and politicians of the day. They viewed 3-2 Battalion as an unnecessary relic of the border war that they were determined and only too eager to put behind them. 3-2 Battalion was moved to Pomfret, an abandoned asbestos mining town. The politicians were determined to present a fresh face now that they had begun the process of negotiations. The commanding officer of 3-2 Battalion was equally determined to showcase the skills and professionalism of his soldiers and pushed for them to be deployed operationally. The operating conditions for 3-2 Battalion were vastly different to what they had been in Angola. The Bush War veterans were thrust into the middle of the political and ethnic violence ravaging South Africa's black townships. Both the IFP and the ANC resented seeing the Angolan veterans trying to keep the peace in a political struggle. They considered the Buffaloes to be mercenaries for the Boers, and their professionalism and impartiality did not suit the narrative that they were trying to create. Indeed, 3-2 Battalion, by its very nature, contradicted the purely black versus white narrative that has come to dominate the struggle against apartheid. For his part, F.W. de Klerk was no friend of the military. Resentful of the massive influence the SADF wielded during the Botha era, de Klerk was determined to bring the generals and the army into line. Furthermore, his wife was an outspoken opponent of conscription, and the generals and veterans looked on in horror as the new leader of the National Party systematically dismantled the most formidable military on the continent. It should come as no surprise then that following some outcry after an incident in Polo Park involving some members of 3-2 Battalion, that de Klerk should make the Buffaloes the scapegoat for criticism from the ANC regarding security force activities.
Gister het die staatspresident meneer F.W. de Klerk bekendgemaak dat die omstrede 3-2 bataljon van die Weermag, tesame met die eenheid vir Woesmans, 3-1 bataljon en die oud polisie-eenheid Koevoet ontbind gaan word. 3-2 bataljon was alweer beskou as een van die mees gedigte gevegseenhede nog in die Weermag.
In 1993, in an act of unforgivable betrayal, F.W. de Klerk announced the disbandment of 3-2 Battalion. The Angolan soldiers who had risked their lives so that white conscripts could stay safe were unceremoniously thrown to the wolves. After the success of the tripartite agreement and the independence of Namibia, the African diplomats concluded that it may be time to bring about a close to the Angolan Civil War. In June 1989, after meetings with dozens of African leaders, UNITA and the MPLA declared a ceasefire, paving the way to a future peace agreement. Eventually, after much more fighting, the By-Chiefs Accords were signed in 1991, paving the way for multi-party elections the following year. As part of these accords, both sides were to disarm and demobilize their armed forces. The MPLA stuck to the agreement and disarmed. UNITA did not. When presidential elections were held in September 1992, Dos Santos of the MPLA won 49.5% of the vote. Savimbi disputed the results of the election, saying they were neither free nor fair. Fighting soon broke out, with the MPLA drawing first blood. In what came to be known as the Halloween Massacre, hundreds of UNITA supporters in Luanda and other MPLA-held towns were rounded up and killed. Savimbi had the next laugh though. With UNITA still armed and mobilized, he went on the offensive in early 1993. In a series of stunning victories, UNITA had seized control of 70% of the country by August 1993. It looked as if the MPLA government was on the point of collapse. Then, in a strange twist of fate, their former enemies became their salvation. Eben Barlow, a former member of 3-2 Battalion's reconnaissance wing, had started a private security company called Executive Outcomes, employing former elite members of the SADF. Executive Outcomes had secured a contract to defend vital oil machinery against UNITA attacks. After the withdrawal of first the Russians and then the Cubans, FAPLA had disbanded as part of the By-Chiefs Accords. When fighting resumed in 1992, the MPLA was without a trained army. The new Angolan army, called the FAA, seemed helpless against the well-trained UNITA guerrillas. The international community was quick to condemn UNITA, but slow to send any military help. In desperation, the MPLA government reached out to Executive Outcomes, their former enemies, and asked them to retrain the Angolan army and take the fight to UNITA. Putting aside past animosities, Barlow accepted the offer and went to Pomfret. The former Buffaloes had little love for UNITA, and having been abandoned by the military, applied the only trade they knew. Executive Outcomes employed former servicemen from all walks. South African pilots even flew the MiG-23s that had once caused them so much trouble. The newly trained Angolan army was led by Executive Outcomes advisors, and as always, the Buffaloes were in the thick of the fighting. The use of mercenaries is always controversial, and their days in Angola were numbered, but Executive Outcomes played a big role in preventing a UNITA takeover in the mid-90s. Jonas Savimbi was no longer the anti-communist darling he pretended to be, and thousands were massacred over the coming years. When the First Congo War broke out, the Angolan government joined the coalition to overthrow Mabuto's government. Mabuto had long been an ally of UNITA and had provided bases for the guerrillas in his country. With foreign support drying up and pressure against the blood diamond trade building, Savimbi's time was also running out. On the 22nd of January 2002, Angolan Special Forces tracked down and killed Jonas Savimbi in Moxico Province, Angola. With his death, the Angolan Civil War finally came to an end. And that brings us to the end of this series, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for watching. I could go into great depth and detail and discussion about who won the battle, what counts as winning the battle, but at the end of the day, that's not why I created this series. This is not a propaganda series. I just wanted to tell the story of the soldiers who fought at Cuito Carnival, how the battle unfolded, and what it looked like, what it must have been like. If you like this series, please like and subscribe to my channel, and if you would like to donate to my Patreon account, you can have a look in the description below. All the details of the account will be there. And thank you again for watching. Thank you to all the servicemen who reached out and have spoken to me, and thank you for their service. Thank you for doing your thing for my freedom and for our way of life. I will see you next time. Goodbye.